Carol, are you going to sit there or are you going to sit in the middle? Maybe, yeah, why don't you all sit together? All right, well, welcome everybody. Glad to see that you are interested in design policy. Some of you are probably asking the question, well, what is design policy? Because I get that question all the time when I talk to people about it and say that this is what I'm working on. I'm Stephanie Yaffe, and I'm introducing you to our panelists today, Carol Strohecker, who's here on my left. She's the Vice Provost of RISD. We have Jeff Davis in the middle, who is from the Rhode Island State Planning Office.
Statewide Planning Program, yep.
Okay. And we have Lynn McCormack, who is from the Arts, Culture, and Tourism Office it's the City of Providence. So I got that. So we have someone who's from educational institution, private educational institution, state government agency, and city government agency. So that's an important thing to note. Just a little bit about me. I am a graduate of RISD. I graduated 25 years ago from the graphic design department. And the way I sort of got into doing work on design policy was really, in one sense, by chance and in one sense by design. I went to school for an MBA and went to George Washington University, where policy is very much discussed in a strategic way. So being from the design field, I wanted to explore how that related and what did it mean for someone in design to develop policy, which is something that I will probably make comments throughout, and I'm sure the presenters will make some references to this, that here in the United States, it's not as commonly understood as it is in other places around the world, like Europe and Asia. And I'll touch on that a little bit in my comments toward the end. But the first thing we're going to do, if hopefully we won't have too many more people coming in the middle of this, but if we do, they can kind of join in. We're going to do a breakout where I'm going to have you go through an exercise. You each have one of these sheets that explains what the breakout session is going to involve. And we're going to spend about 10 minutes. What I've asked is the panelists who kind of circulate and facilitate the conversation in the breakout session. I'm sorry, I didn't introduce. Please introduce yourself again.
Hi, I'm Siobhan O'Kane. I work with Jeff Davis in the statewide planning program.
I'm sorry. So Siobhan is also, she's at the level of knowledge of the panelists and is a great resource for us during the breakout session, and any questions that you may have during the Q&A, she's available as well. So what I had everybody do when you walked in the door was to identify yourself by your discipline, whatever you're studying or practicing. First, let me ask a question. How many, do we have students from RISD? Raise your hand. Students from Brown? Okay, that's interesting. Professionals from the field? Working? Okay. And anybody who's in government, working in government agencies? Okay. Working in an educational institution, teaching? Okay. Okay, and let me just get a sense of what states are you from? Can you just say, like, go around? New York.
Pennsylvania. Colorado.
Rhode Island.
Virginia. Illinois.
Colorado. Massachusetts. Canada.
Georgia.
Illinois.
Maryland. Okay, so the reason why I'm trying to help everybody see where they're from is because geographically, where we're from kind of gives us a perspective on policy in a way. You live in a place, you experience culture in a certain place, you have interaction with government in a certain state, and each is a little bit different. So that's kind of something that I want you to keep in mind when we're doing this exercise, and as we start discussing the sort of current issues that might be on the forefront of your mind. What I'd like you to do is to break out into groups of probably 4, maybe 3 or 4 at most, because we don't really have that many people. So if we do groups of 3 or 4, if you want to just, and try by your wristband, try to make sure that you put yourself in a group with someone else who has different colors on their wristbands. Now I see some of you have multiple wristbands, which is something that I didn't expect from this exercise, but it's an interesting phenomenon. I thought most people would identify themselves with one discipline and put their state on it. So why don't we do that first? Kind of, if you're sitting with people who you think you want to collaborate with, that's fine. If you want to move around and sit with another group of people, that's fine. And what I want you to do is, in this group, identify, you have on your sheet, a particular issue that you would like to develop a policy statement about. And it can be one of these issues that's in the bullet points on the bottom of this sheet, or it can be something that maybe you're working on in a particular project right now in a class, or a design project that you're involved in. And what I want you to do is spend just a few minutes talking about this issue and kind of talking through it, and what kinds of in your mind, policies would help to innovate this particular situation, this issue. And as you're talking about this, you can jot down notes, you can, make a diagram, however you want to do it. But in the end, what I'd like you to do is, in about 10 minutes, come up with at least 2 or 3 sentences that kind of summarizes this issue and your approach to this issue, which is going to be your design policy statement. Does that make sense? You have questions?
I've never written a policy statement.
Okay.
I have a vague notion of what that is.
Okay.
Can you give us some markers?
Okay. Well, let me do this. I was going to do these slides at the end, but these might help, because this will give you a little bit of structure as to. Now, this was sort of the outline of how the breakout session is going to work, but we've done all this, so we can go to the next slide about talking about the characteristics of design policy as it relates to innovation. And I'll just say that the reason why I've sort of chosen this framework is because this is, right now, in terms of the current discussion, and this is happening in various states as well as in countries in Europe, design policy is being defined in most cases in relationship to innovation. And innovation in terms of the definition being, it has a connotation of moving things forward, making either incremental changes, advances in various aspects, whether it be economic, social, environmental. So in terms of thinking about how you're going to write your statement, these are some of the elements that you can use to structure. So focus on collaboration, meaning that you're talking amongst different people from different disciplines, and getting their viewpoints and their positions on a particular issue. Focusing on local participants, meaning people who may be affected by this policy at a local level, meaning a town, a city, a small municipality, community. Focusing on collaboration between organizations, be it government or business, collaboration between government and business, or collaboration between, say, nonprofit, non-government, and business, and designers. And then talking about policy, the statement in terms of some element of the statement being reflexive in terms of educating some aspect of the issue between the designers who may be involved and other disciplines. So these are some of the elements to a policy statement that make it effective.
Can you give an example?
Yes, actually I can. I will show you now a video. If I can get to it. This is an example of a policy statement that recently was formulated by actually a design professional organization called the International Federation of Interior Architects. And I'll just play this video because it's very well explained by just running the video. Here it is. The audio. Sorry. Let me try again. Technical. Let's see. Okay, so let me just give a quick background. This was a similar situation to today, and I also wanted to say this, that what we're doing here today in this panel and this discussion is essentially a simulation of an organization type that exists in certain countries and mostly in Europe, called design councils. And basically, these design councils are formed just like we're doing here today in the breakout, is a form of this type of organization where people from different disciplines who are practicing in different disciplines come together and develop design policy based on particular issues at any point in time. So it could be any of these that are listed on the sheet that we're working from: housing, sustainable buildings, the environment, affordable education, healthcare, and basically developing design policy around these issues. So in this case, and even what we're going to sort of simulate here today, this was a panel that was brought together under the umbrella of this organization, and their goal was to come up with a design policy statement. So I'll just play this video, and this will give you an example of how it came together.
We define design as a cross-collaboration of all disciplines and leverage their knowledge to create an innovation coalition. establish a vision of a prosperous global community, demonstrating the value of design through storytelling and measured economic, social, and environmental impact. Harness the value of design as essential to health and well-being and embed the intrinsic expectations of the value of design through education across society. This will ensure that all designers and design professionals are active participants and leaders in activities and discussions that shape our future quality of life.
Okay, so that's a pretty complicated example, and I was actually pretty impressed by this because if you see, this really addresses a number of points. One, they're defining design as a cross-collaboration of all disciplines. And this is something that is, as I explain to people, probably more of a European approach to defining design than what we think of here in the US. A lot of times when you talk to people about design, they say, well, what are you talking about when you're talking about design? Are you talking about architecture? Are you talking about industrial design? Usually the first comment I get is, you're talking about architecture. That seems to be the relationship that people make when you talk about design. But when we're talking about design informing a policy statement, we're talking about it in terms of either a way of thinking, a strategic approach, a method, or a process. So we're not really thinking of it in terms of a product or a specific discipline when it comes to writing a statement. And this statement also, it addresses being part of a global community. It addresses the economic impact of design and social impact and environmental, social and environmental. And also talking about making sure that people who are considered designers or design thinkers, either in the specific professional sense or people who are using it as a strategic approach, that they are participating as leaders to shape the future. So these are kind of the different components that make an effective statement. I would consider this a very general statement that you could probably come up with more specific statements, I think, in terms of if you want to address a specific issue. And I think that might be an easier approach for what we're going to do here today. Because this statement really is probably more considered as kind of an umbrella statement. And then if I were fleshing out this policy from this statement, I might come in with more specific issues, say, well, how are we going to address affordable housing? And how are we going to address sustainability in buildings? Things like that. So this is an example of a very general statement. So let's spend about the next 10 minutes taking us down and doing a policy statement. And you can also, one of the reasons why I had you say what state you're from is you can also think in terms of specifically the needs, the possible needs of the state that you're from. And you might be very familiar with some of the pressures that your state is facing right now. So you could use that even as a basis to choose a topic for your policy statement. So let's spend the next 10 minutes, and I'm going to ask the panelists to kind of circulate and facilitate as you start your discussion, and then I'll kind of keep time and give you, say, like a 2-minute warning before 10 minutes is up. And then what I'll have you do is, if you feel confident, you can designate one person from your group to get up and give your policy statement. Tell it to the whole group. Do you have any other questions? Does that get you started? I'm seeing some yeses, maybe, maybes.
Seems very broad. I don't know if you can give us any constraints to just help us guide us along, some
Okay.
starters, something like
Well, what I'd like to try to have you do is think in terms of, let's say, I mean, I can speak in terms of from a designer's perspective. How would I innovate, say, in the issue of affordable housing? A general approach, and obviously this is something that, 10 minutes is a short period of time, but to come up with something really comprehensive and maybe meaningful in the long run, but just to sort of brainstorm it. Thinking about, say, the use of a particular section of land that may be zoned for a particular use and is now vacant. It's obviously vacant. So coming in and saying, let's develop a policy to say, if this continues to happen in this particular area, we will address it and set aside looking at the zoning aspects related to assisting the development of affordable housing. So that would be maybe a blanket policy statement. And then, from there, you might you might flesh it out in a more specific way. So that's sort of an example. Let's say delivery of healthcare. Okay, I can give an example, for instance, in Maryland. I don't know if you all followed the news of what happened in Maryland, but we had a really bad rollout of a website that was for the purpose of people signing up for healthcare. In comes the design policymakers to address this problem. And the way in which we might talk about it is, and actually the way in which, this is a real live example, the way in which it was actually dealt with, because the website didn't function the way it was supposed to, the way in which the legislators and people in the government developed policies to deal with it, they said, okay, we're going to set up a program to have people who are called like ambassadors to go out into the community and register people for a healthcare plan. So they quickly developed a policy in order to take care of that issue of delivery of healthcare. So that's kind of another very general example. Yeah, that's a question.
Maybe we could all work on a policy or go together because we are kind of a more intimate group.
Okay.
I don't necessarily feel like there's one particular issue that I think that
Okay.
I want to talk about.
Okay, if that sounds like that would be great to do it that way.
I know someone in the room is maybe working with some policy question that they're interested in sharing, like especially our professional table over here.
We're
a particular issue within, let's say, pick a particular issue within a certain state.
Well, I would suggest, I'm going to kind of throw the spotlight back on the students. This tends to be very abstract.
Sure.
And I'm just imagining this conversation, not to be ageist, but from the perspective of a 19 or 20-year-old, and your head spinning. So, I mean, I'm wondering from your perspective, younger people in the room, what issues do you care about? What matters to you? And maybe from there we could plan something meaningful to actually, sink our teeth into, to think about policy that relates to that. Just
Yeah. Oh, we were just throwing out some ideas also.
Okay, well, we just came from another presentation about kind of turning public space more into like a pedestrian area and not so much cars and like more green space and stuff like that. And so I think like maybe an issue that doesn't necessarily just apply to like one state, but it applies everywhere, is that you need to create more of a space for the people within the city, and then that increases revenue in like retail, it increases, well, it decreases in pollution obviously, and it increases just like I think quality of life because people are happier. There's a number of ways to do this. I think even today is the day where you like roll out like grass in the parking day. You roll out grass in the parking lot, and then you can sit there, and then that kind of is like a mini green space kind of. But they've been like in the previous presentation, they showed a lot about. They did it in New York when they made Broadway like only pedestrian area, and they've been just turning a lot of like unused space into like green space. Like in Texas, they took all these roads that had nothing on them and made them into public squares and stuff like that. There's just so much that you can do with it. So I don't know.
And if we should ground it in the state, I mean, we've been in Providence for 2, 3, 4 years, so I think this is like a perfect example. I mean, Providence has done a lot of this kind of work, right, with us with the circular head, sort of public square, and then also I think parking days are a big deal here. Like the city talks about it a lot. There's like a website I think dedicated to showing where all the parking spots are that you can go. So if we want to ground it in the city or a state, we can talk about what has been done in Providence and how it can be expanded to other parts of the city.
Building on that, I've lived in Providence, and so I'm totally into all these ideas.
And I love all the creativity that comes up in Providence and the ideas that are generated and implemented, but they all seem to be very short-term, like a day here. Or another example was some artists created a mini golf thing over on the west side, but artists created the whole, it was only up for the summer. And what I would like to see from design policy is how to make some of these cool things that happen more integrated in terms of long-term places or spaces that would also draw in tourists, that would create more sustainable long-term impacts for the city rather than like one-offs.
Well, I think the point that you make is really very important, and I was actually going to touch on this later on in part of my presentation. And the whole idea of developing design policy, because a lot of times, and I get this question all the time, is people say, what is design policy and why do we really even need it? Well, here is a really good reason, because here are examples of programs, you might say, that develop somehow, and they last for a very short period of time. People respond very positively. They benefit people in various ways, whether it be socially or economically or in other ways. But yet there's nothing to hold that in place or to not necessarily repeat that, but encourage things like that to continue to happen, to develop people's quality of life over time. And I think that is really kind of the essence, and it is very abstract in terms of defining what policy is and defining what design policy is. And that is a very good argument for why we need it. And I have to say concretely, I'll get to it in a minute, that in Europe, they've kind of already come to that conclusion a while ago. And they realized that by developing this policy, this is what drives these programs and allows these kinds of things to happen over time. And they have long-term plans. They plan 10 years out, 20 years out, and that's their design policy. It's a 20-year plan, strategic plan. So thank you for that comment. That's really important.
I was just gonna mention that in all the previous examples that they gave of when they would just like create a space for the people, like the people would always come and use it almost like instantaneously. So like I don't know if like when you're designing a policy, like I think you don't have to think as much about like, oh, how will this like survive? Because I feel like if you get the initial part down, like if you create the space and it's been shown in all the other cities where it's been tried, that people will just like come and use it. And it integrates into that part of the community. So I don't know if that affects design policy at all.
Well, I think that's also a very good point, is that, and this is, I have to say, this is also in work that I'm doing in Maryland. And I'm going to talk more specifically about what I'm working on with a group, small group of people after the panelists have a chance to present. Because what is very important about talking about, when you talk about design policy and developing design policy, you have to give examples and you have to do almost an analysis of giving the example of what the program or the outcome is or was, what the impact was, and then how to do that on a long-term, in a long-term plan. So those are kind of three major components, I think, because otherwise people sort of hear design policy and say, well, that's very abstract, right? I don't know what that is. I don't know how or why we need it. So those aspects are very important to document and use that as a point to further develop additional policy or additional strategic policy. So that's very common. So I'm going to stop for now on this exercise, and I thank you for indulging me in doing this. I'll just say that we did a similar exercise last year when we had the panel. We did it at the end of the presentation, and a lot of people felt that the feedback that I got, that they kind of didn't have enough time to really work through it. And I realize it is some of it an abstract kind of assignment to do in a short period of time. And I encourage you to continue to think about it, because it's not something that you can essentially do in a short breakout session. I've been working at this for 15 years. So it's a constantly changing, evolving, and very broad and deep kind of exercise that I encourage you all to continue. So now I want to turn to the panelists, because they've been very patient in waiting to present. And each of them now will just spend a few minutes talking about their own practice and background and involvement in policy, and they each have a presentation to make. And what I want to say again is that essentially what we have here today are three perspectives that would essentially, if we created a design council, these are three very important perspectives to have on council to develop policy. So we have Jeff Davis, who's from a very data-driven perspective. We have Carol Strecker, who's from an educational policy and education perspective. And we have Lynn McCormick, who's from a more cultural policy perspective. And so these are all important components and viewpoints to developing design policy. So now I'll turn it over to the panelists to do their presentation. And you can go first, whoever wants to go first. Did you want to do it? Are you okay?
Okay. So my name is Carol Strohecker. I'm the Vice Provost at RISD, and I've been here just for a year. So I'd like to tell you a bit about my bio, as Stephanie has asked, but it's actually built into the talk, so I'll reveal a bit about my relevant experience as I touch on some examples. I'd like to show you some books that have become framing for me as I've been thinking about these design policy issues and as they have informed different initiatives that I've been part of over the years. Do any of these books look familiar to anyone? Okay, so you'll see how they might play in as I describe some of the work. So I did my graduate work a long time ago, and I've been working for a long time, but I'm going to begin this story about 15 years ago when the MIT Media Lab engaged a partnership with the government of Ireland to create Media Lab Europe. And the idea at that time, so it was a very different moment. 15 years ago, the economy in Ireland was doing very well. And it was called the Celtic Tiger. It was doing exceptionally well. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that they had a workforce of English-speaking people who were ready when the software industry and other technology industries in the United States were maturing and wanted to distribute their products throughout Europe and even more broadly. So people were moving into Ireland, they were getting jobs, and more American companies were moving there, and the government realized they wanted to have also a research model which had not yet really existed in that country. So at the same time, Ireland was beginning something called Science Foundation Ireland, which was sort of a counterpart to the National Science Foundation here in the United States. And just as a number of us researchers in higher education were starting Media Lab Europe, a former program manager from National Science Foundation was also moving to Dublin to get Science Foundation Ireland started. So the idea here was to demonstrate applications of technologies as they could then become part of a research and development process so that new products could find their way into the economy. And interestingly, that project was situated not only within a national context of economic development, but also we were engaged throughout Europe. So we were called Media Lab Europe, and we did have researchers coming from all over Europe. And the idea was that our work would engage universities and companies throughout Europe, as indeed the work did. But this slide I'm showing also because we were not only in an economic development context in terms of national and international economies, we were also in the context of urban renewal within Dublin. So Media Lab Europe, you can see this picture on the right, that's an old Guinness hop store, so-called. That's a warehouse where Guinness used to store grain that they used to make the beer, the hops for the grain, for the beer. So, but it had been sitting empty for a long time because contemporary practices of manufacturing the beer, pasteurization, inventory of the grain, all of that had changed, and they didn't need all of the square footage that had been required at one time. So we went in and renovated this beautiful old building, and it was part of a larger renovation of a so-called digital district in the western part of Dublin. So I told the story that way because I went from that context of Media Lab Europe to this terrain in North Carolina, back in the United States. And that's a part of the country, the northwest part of the state of North Carolina, called the Piedmont Triad. So it's west of the Research Triangle that many of you may have heard of, but east of the mountains, and it's this area called the Piedmont Triad. And that's an area where historically the economy had been based on the manufacture of agricultural products. So it was wood to furniture in the city of High Point. Many people from RISD would know about that furniture market. It was also cotton to textiles and also tobacco to cigarettes. And because of the way the global economy has shaped up, all of those industries have diminished. Many of them have vanished entirely as they've gone off now to Asia. So a lot of jobs have been lost in this part of North Carolina. And people in the state got together and said, we think design can offer a solution. We know that computer technologies are very important. So we're going to educate people to understand more about digital design. They need to know more about computer technologies as they're incorporated in design processes. And if we can design more products, even if they're manufactured offshore, we still will have industries related to those creative processes, and chances are new companies will start so that we will do the manufacture here. So that was the premise. And within the University of North Carolina system, so these are the 16 campuses of that very large state university system. And in the northwest part of the state, 3 schools came together. Winston-Salem State University, which is a historically black university, very interesting, but with a well-developed research capability. A performing arts conservatory. So very interesting take on creative process and design processes as they're situated in theater arts, music, dance, but also a technically oriented community college. So the idea that we want these computer processes to be close to market, if you will. You know, as new companies start up and those new jobs get created from the new things that we're designing, we want to be able to educate quickly more and more people to take on the new jobs. So that consortium came together in this Center for Design Innovation, and that's where I was the inaugural director. It's where I was just before I came here to RISD. And we did have a lot of computers, a lot of 3D printers, working with different software techniques and so on. And again, the Center for Design Innovation was situated not only in the context of regional economic development, but in a context of urban renewal. So you see there an old factory of the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. A lot of the land around it that is now being renovated and redeveloped as a research park in the downtown area of Winston-Salem. And you can see here an aerial view where the highway, Route 40, comes together with the north-south state route of 52. And the red delineated area there is where the building is now under construction that we designed for the Center for Design Innovation. And there's that same highway intersection with the site of the Center for Design Innovation, and the area to the north there, the blue part, is a biotechnology park now associated with Wake Forest University. So that little red rectangle where the Center for Design Innovation is now being constructed looks like this at the site, and there are some of the footprints from the architectural design. But while we were designing the building and while we're waiting for construction, we had programs well underway, lots of seminars about different digital design techniques, a well-developed motion capture kind of capability, with all of the software development that goes along with that. So many of you know that if you do motion capture of a human figure, for example, you'll generate a very dense data set, but you can then use that to fuel the movements of cartoon characters. So that's a new technique for animation. that we were developing. And we were also basing it on a high-speed videography kind of capability. So it's a very particular approach to motion capture. And the same software then that we would use for the animation, we could also use for 3D modeling of objects that would come out of 3D printers. So motion capture and rapid prototyping were the two big strategies that we were using in the Center for Design Innovation. Here's a medical instrument, an endoscope, just one example of some very healthy, vibrant collaborations with biotech designers, biotech researchers, and we were designers. And just some other illustrations, another illustration of the building, and a representation of the optimism that this center has brought to the area. So while I was at CDI, Center for Design Innovation, I engaged a dialogue with other people involved in this kind of approach of using advanced technologies to innovate design processes and to generate new potentials for economic development. And we received a grant in 2011, which was part of a larger set of grants that helped to generate a network that we called SEED, Sciences, Engineering, Arts, and Design. So acknowledging what Stephanie had pointed out earlier, the need for broadly collaborative teams to generate the innovative ideas. And these are the different small grants that funded convenings of interdisciplinary researchers and designers around the country as we were forming this network. So we were here in 2011. And then the network is now well underway. And we really are an advocacy group. So a lot of the goal is to help generate policy through advocating for these 4 goals: research and creative work, learning and education, partnership, and culture and economic development. So there's been a lot of activity around this. And if you Google the SEED network, you'll see a lot of work. We've had an international call for white papers, and MIT Press is now publishing the results of that. So lots of good work there that's setting a basis for policy discussions around the country right now. Now you'll recognize in that acronym, it's very similar. Sciences, Engineering, Arts, and Design, of course, is a very similar acronym to STEAM, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you. So this STEM to STEAM initiative that RISD had a lot to do with starting says, let's take what the United States government has said is an educational priority, and they put a lot of money into curricula for sciences, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And we're saying, let's inject the A for arts into that. And some people understand this as a policy move actually to promote arts education, K through 12. And in a sort of cynical way, you could say, well, this is cultivating our future applicants to RISD, and that is indeed a very pragmatic goal. But most people would recognize that this, again, is a statement of the value of collaboration and really broadly interdisciplinary collaboration. So this has resulted in a number of policy endeavors, congressional hearings. There is a congressional caucus called STEAM that generated 2 resolutions within the House of Representatives, and this is growing now within the U.S. Congress. More and more Congress people stepping up and saying, we're taking this message back to our constituencies across the country, and we're hearing from them that they want to see more and more curricula having to do with this interdisciplinary initiative. We have a STEM to STEAM map now, in which people self-elect to enter their names as part of this nationwide network. And you can see we look at it according to emphases on research, education, policy, and industry. And I'll just end with one more example of this kind of policy-making sort of approach. This is a conference that was held at MIT a year ago, the Science of Digital Fabrication. A lot of this we would recognize as having to do with 3D printing. But actually at MIT, they're looking at every scale imaginable, all the way, looks from the nanoscale through the human scale of things that we can make, that we can sit in, that we can hold, but even to the buildings that we inhabit and even to the cities that we move through. So they're really looking at how digital fabrication has a role to play at each of those scales of the environmental and human experience. And at this conference, there were representatives of all of these different federal agencies who one by one came up to the microphone and said, our agency is declaring this a priority. We will make funding available for these initiatives across the country in digital manufacturing. And indeed, we're seeing some of those funding opportunities emerging now. And I'll just close with one more quote. If you don't know this one, I would highly recommend it. It talks in particular about the RISD approach to education, the notion of studio learning, critique, which is part of that, and it's really the basis of the STEM to STEAM initiative. So I know I've gone on for a while. I'll come out of this. And I'll invite my colleague now to come up. I'll bring up the next presentation.
Okay. 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 Yeah.
So I know it is 4:41 and it's supposed to stop at 4:45. So I'm going to be super brief and so we may have to do some improv today, so I'm going to do some improv. And I hope you'll bear with me. So I was asked today to, again, Jeff Davis with the Rhode Island Statewide Planning Program. I work for the state government. We are here to help. I was going to talk today about how we at the state level use data and mapping to drive decision-making and policy. And I just thought, rather than going through my slides, just give you a quick example of one thing that we've been working on over the last year or so. We're the recipient of a HUD Sustainable Communities Grant, which is allowing us to do some really interesting planning work, collaborate with a lot of different places throughout the state, people throughout the state, and different offices and topic areas that we wouldn't normally work with. And one of the things we've been charged with doing is developing a new economic development plan for the state. And that has been a really fascinating process for us. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with economic development in Rhode Island, particularly of late, but it's all about let's make a deal, who do you know, hunting for those big elephants to attract and bag for the state and then drag over here. And we're really looking to do something different with this new economic development plan. We're almost, I won't say we're indifferent to the strategies that actually come out of the plan. We're far more interested in the policy design, the process of making economic development decisions in the future. And just very quickly, to summarize what we have in our current draft plan and the way we hope to encourage all decision-making related to economic development in the state to take place. And this may sound like common sense, but it tends not to happen. First of all, set your goal. What is it that you want to accomplish with your policy? Figure out the data that you need to know whether or not you're progressing towards that goal. 3, hold ourselves accountable. So often we will set a policy and just assume it's going to work and keep throwing money at it and really have no way of knowing are we achieving what we set out to achieve. So we need to hold ourselves and our partners accountable for achieving what we set out to. Next, innovation. And this is probably the most difficult one for government. And the higher the level of government, the more difficult it is to innovate. But giving the government permission to try new things, because obviously what we've been doing has not been working. Try new things to innovate and to allow ourselves to fail sometimes, so long as we're keeping our goal in mind, that we're tracking the data, that we're able to hold ourselves accountable and change course if we see that what we're doing isn't working. And the way in which we can do this, we see the role of the state really as being one of convener. So a lot of the specific examples you just saw from Ireland and North Carolina are things we'd like to try to do here in Rhode Island. Really allow the state to serve as that central hub, not only of information for businesses, for makers, for designers, for artists, for people who want to start a business, entrepreneurs, but also for the public at large, so that we can be that source of information, also create places throughout the state, physical places, virtual spaces, where people can come together, collaborate, and make things in the state that are greater than the sum of their parts. Because we recognize that we're not the innovators, we're not the designers, we're not the entrepreneurs. So we see our role as providing that space, the manure, if you will, for those wonderful flowers to grow. And finally, really looking to do that in a way that is equitable, where we are being open to not only as many disciplines as possible, but really being mindful about all people in the state, regardless of their racial background, their incomes, disability, and really trying to make sure we are unlocking the capabilities and the potential of everyone in the state to take full advantage and participate in our economy. I will show you one slide which, as a quick example of how we hope to do this. This is an example of what's called opportunity mapping. Partnered with the Kirwan Institute out of the Ohio State University to map what they have found over the last 10 years or so to be some of the major indicators of opportunity, of personal success. Basically, we have an understanding now that the zip code or the census tract in which you were born plays a huge role in the outcomes of your life and the opportunities that you have to thrive. So what we're hoping to do is that the state can take this information about access to education, to jobs, to housing, transportation, health, and find out where there are the greatest opportunities, where opportunities are poorest, and overlay that with other data. The example you see here, the darker red are areas with higher educational outcomes and opportunities throughout the state. The lighter the color, the lesser the opportunity. And the blue is the location of subsidized affordable housing throughout the state. And no surprise, a lot of that is located in areas with lower educational opportunities. So how do we use this information then to inform policy, to direct our resources in education where it can be most, to figure out how to geographically deconcentrate our affordable housing so that people who live there have greater access to opportunity. So again, just a quick opportunity to go over with you one example of how the state plans to implement that. So that's all I'm going to say, given our time, and hopefully we'll have some time for conversation.
And Lynn?
I have no slides. I have due to this talk from my experience. I graduated from Rhode Island School of Design in 1987 and was a working artist in the community here and became involved in city government through the track of creating large-scale festivals and events for the city to bring people together, to gather people, to rediscover what Providence was trying to rebuild itself as. So I did a lot of work in that kind of vein for about 6 to 7 years within city government, and then sort of shifted into a redesign of our department out of an Office of Cultural Affairs to a citywide Office of Art, Culture, and Tourism. And in 2008, we started a project called to do a cultural plan for the city. That cultural plan included over 2,500 participants, and in the end, from a bottom-up, top-down process that was very egalitarian, very democratic, and looked at the whole ecology of the city and how arts and culture and design in particular integrate into the city making. We came up with this cultural plan that then became part of our comprehensive plan, integrated into our comprehensive plan, that then became a decision-making policy statement around how to do work going forward. And we got a HUD Sustainable Communities grant as well. And in our grant, we really integrated arts and cultural opportunities along all those same kind of strategies. And then that then informed our zoning ordinance, and so now we're changing the way we're doing zoning in the city to be able to really support the arts and cultural and design-based businesses in different areas. So it's a bit like, but I want to go back to what you said about pop-up Providence, because it's a very specific example of, as a person who's a practitioner in city government, I'm often the victim of a policy director who decides he's going to write an economic development policy for the city and not talk to the people who are actually doing the work. So I caution any of you that want to get into policy that you're not putting yourself up into a bubble and not talking to practitioners, because often in city government, policy is driven by practice and experimentation. And so this pop-up Providence piece that you're talking about that's very temporary is very temporary for a direct reason. It's to inspire people to think of those spaces in a different way so that then the policy will follow and that the better design work will come in behind it. But to activate spaces that nobody's really thinking about right now. And much of what we've done in Providence has been developed in that way. We are also very beholden to policies from the federal government and how we are to use money in different ways. And so there's an inherent tension in federal policy versus local practice and what we need to do locally. And so there's this very, very, amazing dialogue between the feds and the city government and the state government around how to do all those things. I think Carol's example of the South Carolina project, the North Carolina project, and the Media Lab in Europe, is those two projects were driven by an economic need. When those projects started, there was a core group of people who understood the power of what they could be. But I'm guessing that it was very hard to explain that to elected officials and politicians. There is a translation problem in our worlds. And so many times, as designers, as design-based thinkers, we need to show people what this translates into. And hopefully we'll start to see that happening in Rhode Island soon. But right now, we're at a logjam. We can't convince the people that we work with in government as easily and simply as we should be able to that design is actually an incredibly important industry in the state and it has a lot to contribute. Rhode Island School of Design was established in 1870-something to feed industry, to feed the industries of design, of our textile mills, our jewelry manufacturing, our silver manufacturing. It was to create designers to keep our industry going, and now this great manufacturing thing that you just launched last week is sort of re-energizing that whole notion. But as designers, I want to ask you all, you need to integrate yourselves into the process of government. You need to become advocates for this work. You need to speak out. You need to show up at meetings and say, why is this a temporary thing that should be permanent, right?
But what meeting?
Well, you don't even need to show up to a meeting. To be honest, in Providence, I can tell you that if you call the planning department and say, I'd like to be able to contribute somehow, they come up with a way we do that. We have a RISD grad right now who is, he just wants to help work on the urban environment. He's almost an embedded artist in the planning department at this point, working on nitty-gritty things like where lighting should go in a new park. But there's a translation problem. So you have to come up with ways to talk about these concepts with elected officials that they understand. And so the U.S. Mayor's Conference teamed up with the National Endowment for the Arts to create the Mayor's Institute on City Design. And the whole Our Town program out of the National Endowment for the Arts is really set up as a creative placemaking program to engage elected officials. And so it's all new. In Europe, we can point to Europe all the time we want, but in Europe this has been going on for thousands of years. And in the U.S., we are not in that, we don't have the same relationship with art and design in our everyday lives as we'd like to. We all love to live in Europe. But so we have to work at it. So I'm just here to encourage you to do that. We're short on time, so I'm not going to waste some of the other things. That we were going to have a good dialogue about our planning processes and how they were different. But we can do that another time. And I'll just let you finish up.
Thank you, Lynn. And I just want to wrap up. Yes, thank you to all the panelists. I mean, I think that, there's nothing more that I can say. It's really, they've said it in great terms. But what I would just like to follow up with, and we're just about to wrap up because I'm told there's another speaker that starts at 5 that's at the Chase Center. What we're doing in Maryland right now, and this is something that's also happening in Europe, is in Maryland, a state platform that we are developing for this kind of interchange that Lynn is referring to. And talking amongst all of these interests, designers talking to the politicians and people among the different disciplines. And the way in which it's being done, we have, in Maryland, we're setting up an electronic platform to do this, starting with Maryland Design Day, which is going to happen during National Design Week, which is, if any of you are familiar with it, sponsored by the Smithsonian Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum. We are going to have probably a part-day blog discussion to encourage this kind of dialogue. And this is where it all starts. This is really essentially where the policy starts. In Europe, they have a program, and you can look this up, it's out on the web, it's called Design for Europe. And essentially they're doing the same thing. They are collaborating amongst various universities, educational institutions, and design councils to facilitate this dialogue. They're doing it through conferences, EU-wide conferences, web platforms. And this is, I mean, the internet and these websites are key, I think, right now to encouraging this dialogue, which is where the policy discussion starts. So I just wanted to wrap up with that, and if you have any questions, we'll stick around. You can talk to any one of us. I'll be around the conference tomorrow. I can answer questions during the day. If you see me, just pull me aside, and I can tell you more about what we're doing. The last thing is we have some handouts on the table in the back. These are examples of documents that we have used in Maryland. Number one is a legislative proposal summary to create a design advisory council in Maryland. This is a kind of a template that you might want to use if you are thinking about doing this in your respective state. We have a fact sheet about the STEM to STEAM program, which Carol spoke about, and also the document that contains the language of the STEM to STEAM legislation is back there, if you like. And then I also included an example of a piece of testimony that I wrote in response to a bill that was introduced in the legislature in Maryland this past session called, it was an economic development bill called the Commission on Maryland's Future. And basically it was a proposal to put together an economic development plan. It did not mention design at all in the draft or the presentation of the bill, which is why I responded with this piece, which talked about how design is important in driving innovation. So feel free to pick up a copy of any of these documents for your future use. And I encourage you to ask questions. If you want to email with any of us, we'd be glad to exchange emails and continue this conversation. And thank you for coming.